Okay, now we're going to take a look at the problems where you have to factor a quadratic trinomial or a quadratic binomial where you only have the quadratic and linear term. So if we take a look over here at question number 1, we have a quadratic trinomial. And we focus on our a term to start, and we see that a is equal to 1. And when a is equal to 1, it's very easy to factor. We look for the numbers whose product will be negative 40, because 1 times negative 40 gives us negative 40. It's a times c. And we look for the numbers whose product will give you the negative 40, but whose sum will be equal to your b term of negative 18. Well, the two factors of negative 40 that sum to negative 18 are negative 20 and 2. Now, because our a term is equal to 1, we can set up our expressions right away where we have x and x, because x times x will give me 1x squared. And we can go ahead and fill in minus 20 and plus 2, and we are done. Now, if we continue to take a look at question number 2, we have 16x squared equals 56x. We must remember that when trying to solve a quadratic using factoring, we are going to have to make sure that one side of the equation is set equal to 0. My recommendation is you always keep the quadratic term positive. So we're going to take the linear term and we're going to remove it from the side by subtracting 56x. So we'll have 16x squared minus 56x equals 0. Now the steps to factoring say look for a GCF. Well, my GCF between these two terms are 8x. So we factor the 8x out of every term and we're left with 2x minus 7 equals 0. Now we use the zero product property, where one of our factors must be equal to 0 in order the product to be 0. So I take 8x and set it equal to 0. I take the 2x minus 7 and set it equal to 0, and we continue to solve. So the first one, when I divide both sides by 8, gives me a value of x equals 0. The second one tells me to go through and I add 7 to both sides and I divide by 2, and I get x is equal to 7 halves. So my two solutions are x equals 0 and x equals 7 halves. So as we continue down and we take a look at question number 7, we have 6x squared plus 9 equals negative 55x. So we're going to solve this by factoring. We have to use factoring in this case. We cannot solve by taking the square root because we have this linear term. We're only able to solve using that method of square root is when we have a quadratic and a constant term. So we're going to go ahead. We already got the 6x squared to be positive, so let's move the linear term to the other side by adding 55x. And when we move it to the other side, we're going to write it in standard form. So we'll have 6x squared plus 55x plus 9 and set it equal to 0. Now, we take a look. Our a term does not equal 1. We see that our a term is equal to 6. So we're going to go through and we're going to use the method of grouping in order to factor this. So once again, we're going to start out by taking the product of a times c. And the product of a times c, when we go ahead and multiply that out, should be 54. Then we're going to use find the product, the factors of 54, whose sum is equal to our b term, which is 55. Now this one is quite simple. The factors of 54 that add to 55 are 54 and 1. So now all we're going to do is we are going to rewrite our quadratic trinomial using these new factors. We're going to split up our b term. So when I rewrite this, I get 6x squared plus 54x plus 1x plus 9, and I set that equal to 0. All right, so we're now going to factor by grouping. We factor the pairs up, we group the pairs up, and with the first pair, I can factor out a 6 and an x. And I will be left with 6x on the outside, and I have x plus 9. Now when I take a look at the next pair, the only thing I can factor out is a positive 1. So I still need to show that I can factor out a positive 1. So I put a plus 1. And we're going to pull that plus 1 out, and we're left with x plus 9 equals 0. Now we see we have our common factor of x plus 9, so we know we did it correctly. So we'll pull out the x plus 9. And we're going to be left with 6x plus 1 equals 0. Now that we have that, we can use our zero product property and set each one equal to 0. So when the first factor, the solution will be x equals negative 9. For the second one, when I set that up, I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides. And then we're going to divide by 6. And we come up with x equals negative 1/6. Now, I do want to say this, order does not matter. If you notice here, I put 54 plus 1x. Some of you guys may have written it in the other order, and I'm just going to show that real quick. If you had written it in the other order, you would have 6x squared plus 1x plus 54x plus 9 equals 0. Now, out of the first one here, the only thing we can factor out is an x. So we are going to be left with 6x plus 1. And out of the second set, I can factor out a positive 9. And remember, when you factor out a positive, you should put the plus sign there to remind you that you need to show the plus sign when you factor it out. So we're left with 6x plus 1 equals 0. And we can see that we got the 6x plus 1 in common, and we would be left with the x plus 9. And if we were to continue to solve that, we would end up with the same answers that we got below. Okay, so hopefully that will help you review. Again, make sure you guys practice these questions and get comfortable with them, because this is a skill that doesn't go away and you will need to use it for the rest of this year and any future mathematics classes that you go into. All right, have a good night.